All right. Hi, everyone. On behalf of HR.com, welcome to this webcast, Winning the War on Talent by Achieving Pay Equity, sponsored by Trusaic. This webcast has been pre-approved for one HRCI credit. You may also submit it for SHRM credit, so please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credit. You'll receive an email from HR.com within 2 business days. That will include your certification information. And then you can also go to your HR.com account at any time to see the credits that you have accumulated. It's actually in the top right-hand corner under your profile, so check that out. So during this webcast, if you have questions, the chat is open for some engagement. However, if you have questions for Joanna, we ask that you put those in the Q&A in your webinar controls. And actually, now it is my privilege to introduce to you our presenter, Joanna Kimbernetti. Joanna is a former partner of Aiken Gump, has over 20 years of experience advising clients in a wide range of employment, tax, intellectual property, and other related business issues. We are so pleased to have her here again with us today. It's always a treat when she presents for us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Joanna.
Thank you so much, Rhonda, and good afternoon, everyone. So pay equity matters. And this is a quote from the Harvard Law School Forum, really kind of underscoring how winning the war on talent, to do that, having pay equity is going to be extremely important to that. And so when we consider pay equity through the lens of winning the war on talent, there are a number of factors making pay equity increasingly important as important ammunition in winning that war. First, there's a tight labor market, and more than ever, there's choices, more and more choices for workers in terms of where they want to work. I am sure you have all heard about the Great Resignation, and so many workers are changing jobs. This is particularly so in the post-COVID zeitgeist, in which remote working is the norm, particularly with professionals where attracting talent can be the most competitive. And survey after survey, younger workers are finding an employer with a commitment to pay equity an increasingly important consideration. So that's the first consideration. Number two, there is an increasing regulatory pressure towards achieving pay equity. And they kind of go on sort of 3 or 4 fronts. One is the various pay transparency regulations. Basically, workers will know what you are paying. And they could be, as simple as the requirement to post job salary ranges for positions. And indeed, and even in Colorado, they're asking, potentially asking for promotions, sort of what the job pay ranges are. There is a, significant trend of where if an employee asks for the job pay range, the employer has to provide it, such as in California. So these kind of transparency regulations. There's also a different bucket of sort of pay data reporting regulations, and these are requirements to report pay data to the a government agency. So in California, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, they're requiring employers to submit pay data. And some of you, those in California, will be familiar with it. It is similar to the EEO-1 Component 2 reporting that had been required under the EEOC for a couple of years, and there was some, controversy with that. But that's really a similar model. It's more extensive than that EEOC model, but that California pay data reporting is modeled after that. So, not to be outdone by itself, California now has pending legislation to require that pay data that's being reported to be disclosed to the public. So there's that pay data reporting bucket. There's also other pay equity auditing and compliance laws. The most significant one is Illinois. They are requiring employers to verify that they've actually achieved equal pay, and where an officer has to sign off on that verification. That law went into effect last year and was enacted last year. I think it starts, the reporting period, I think, begins next year. There's, in this fourth bucket, sort of the broader shadow cast by pay discrimination law. Basically, there's been a trend, particularly over the last about 5 years, where pay discrimination laws are getting looser, making it easier for former or current employees to sue for pay discrimination. That in part was the expansion of what the scope was under the federal law for equal pay, or Title VII. And that includes that, there's some jurisdictions that are more of a equal pay for equal work, more strict in terms of, like, for example, job categories and, whether it's race or gender. And it allows more the groupings to be broader, so that it's not exactly the same work, but it could be comparable work, substantially similar work, and allowing more folks to be grouped in and compared. In a different category in this expansion of pay discrimination law is to narrow affirmative defenses that employers can use to justify pay differentials. And so, the pay differentials are typically like seniority, tenure, merit, but they now have to be tied to the job and tied to business necessity. So why is Susie getting paid less than John? A legitimate factor could be that John has more experience, number of years, or he's been with the company longer. Like, these are sort of the more typical legitimate factors, but they need to be tied to it. If there's no relationship to it, there's a potential that those are not being considered. And of course, they vary by jurisdiction, but it's this, restriction of these affirmative defenses that employers can to assert against pay discrimination. Another one is to allow certain safe harbors for those employers who engage in pay equity auditing. So this is putting pressure on employees to do the pay equity audit. This is in Massachusetts, in Colorado. So there's the various pay regulatory framework, in addition to the broadening of the pay discrimination lawsuit framework. I mean, even Mississippi is getting in on the act. In January, it just passed a bill in the House. We'll see what happens. But there is this trend to make it easier for employees to sue and harder for employers to defend against. And so you have that. You've got the regulatory landscape of pay transparency, pay equity auditing, pay data reporting. So there's that bucket plus the market bucket that we just talked about at the get-go. So in short, there's pressure on all three fronts: market pressure, regulatory pressure, legal pressure. And remember that pay equity is more than just equal pay. It's also about equal promotion, hiring, retention, and also equal access to opportunities such as even overtime, special projects, receiving development and feedback, receiving recognition and praise, participation in mentorship programs, training, whether or not inclusive leadership is reflecting support for all staff equitably, based on resources and visible commitment to pay equity, equity sentiment among employees. There's, pay equity is not just about pay, but there are other categories that can indirectly go to equal pay or ultimately impact equal pay. So bottom line is, if you want to win the war on talent, you need to have a pay equity plan. Next slide. Okay, so that was a mouthful. So given this backdrop, today we're going to talk about ascending the pay equity maturity model, the different levels, and how pay equity planning can help you win the war on talent. Okay, next slide. So ascending the pay equity model, maturity model, you see here, there's sort of three tiers: strategic, programmatic, and foundational. And at the base is foundational. And so the pay equity maturity model is about figuring out where you are. And these are, it's a spectrum. You may be kind of at the high level of foundation, low level programmatic, high level programmatic, and so on. So, notably among these three levels, however, a theme runs through the ascension. And that theme is that analytics plays a critical role in moving from one level to the next. And that makes sense. How will you know where you want to go if you don't know where you are? And if you put the tools in place to move from one level to another, how do you know if you've actually gotten there? And how long did it take? Over what time? How much progress did you make? These kind of analytics, these sort of metrics are necessary to understand your baseline, understand what your goals are, understanding how much progress you've made, and understanding whether or not the tools you put in place have actually affected, getting closer to the goal. So we're going to go into detail in for each of these tiers and how to ascend from one level to the next. All right, next slide. So let's talk about the baseline. Where are you? So these are the kind of questions that are going to help you understand what your current pay equity level is. So where are you in the model? So from the policy standpoint, what are they for base pay, bonuses, hiring, retention, promotions, development opportunities, all the areas that impact pay? What are your policies towards equal pay in these, in these different policies? Okay, next category, processes. What are the processes you have in place to achieve pay equity? Onboarding, job placement, recruiting, promotions, compensation, offboarding, all of the sort of processes in your workforce. What are you doing with respect to pay equity in these processes? Next category, what are you measuring? And we've been talking about that. So there are so many things to measure. Compensation, which is clearly the most data-centric and could be messy. That data is the base of measurement. So compensation can include sort of your base pay, your salary, or your sort of set base, and then whatever bonuses, overtime, other incentives, all of which are very data heavy. So you're going to have to measure all that, or have had measured. The other analytics that go indirectly to pay. So it's not just about pay. You're going to also need analytics in terms of what are the numbers, as I had alluded to before: hiring, promotion, retention, participation in the various different opportunities, etc. So those are the kind of metrics you're going to be looking at. And then with regard to compliance, where are you in compliance with laws and regulations? So we talked about, I had alluded to initially, about pay transparency, pay data reporting, pay equity auditing, and then of course the broad shadow of pay discrimination. Where are you on that? And if the answer is I don't know, that's not a good place to be. Okay. So next consideration in figuring out where you are, where is your stakeholder involvement? So is it a C-suite level only consideration? Is there even C-suite level consideration? Is there someone charged with sort of managing the pay equity planning? Is there a team? What about employee involvement? What is their, what is their role in your pay equity plan? They're certainly going to be the ones seeing the outcome of it, but what is their role and involvement in making that happen? Then where are you in terms of sharing your commitment, progress, and goals on pay equity? So are you communicating that to your employees? And what exactly are you communicating? And are you being consistent with that communication? Having employees see what you're doing, and also just what's your external messaging, because that comes back to your workforce and your potential workforce. Because if it's your brand, the people who are looking for a possible job at your company, they understand your brand, or they will want to understand your brand in coming to your company. So messaging that is going to be important. Okay. Do you tie bonuses and compensations to compensation rewards to pay equity goal performance? Really, we're talking about accountability. What is your accountability? So if you have a plan and there's no accountability in terms of measuring it, then what is your tactic to make it happen? Accountability is very important. We had Harvard Business Review do an analytics survey for us with SHRM. It was a survey just last year, surveying about more than 1,000 employers in all different industries, wide range of employer size. And one of the biggest hurdles to achieving pay equity was this issue of accountability. And so that's, assess what is your company doing to have some kind of means to, achieving success? What is your accountability? Okay, next slide. Okay, Rhonda, if you could launch the poll question.
Just going there now, folks. I'll just read out the question for folks, Joanna. Are you making strides to achieve pay equity to help retain and attract new talent? The options are yes or no. We're in the process of making it a priority. And then I don't know. And if anyone doesn't happen to see this pop up, your feedback's still very important. So just toss your answer in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm just going to let it roll. Getting lots of responses here, Joanna.
Great.
Just another 10 seconds, and then I'll share the results with you, Joanna, and you can share them with the audience, the attendees. All right. There, do you see that?
Yes, yes.
Great.
So for your, I'm glad to see that a significant portion of you are making strides to achieve pay equity. We've got 44% yes, 9% no, 27% in the process of making it priority, and 19% I don't know. So, you know, it's important. Pay equity, as for the reasons that I talked about, it's important if you want to win the war on talent. So if you are in the I don't know, and you're part of you know, your company's team to with respect to pay and in HR, you should find out. In terms of those folks who are in the process of making a priority, that's terrific. That's important to make progress, because at the end of the day, less than half of you have been making strides. So it's important that, you know, that you at least get to the point where you know where you are, so you can see what strides need to be made. Okay, next slide. So my guess is a vast portion of you are at the foundational level. And that's this first tier of pay equity maturity. This is sort of the base one. And here, you know, these are kind of some of the features of foundational entry level early level understanding of pay equity. There isn't a robust pay equity measurement system in place. There isn't a DEI culture, or it's insufficient. Employee inclusion, or, you know, sort of inclusion sentiment isn't being considered. You know, compliance, there are compliance issues with pay equity, and perhaps sort of the outcome of it is there's a lack of workforce diversity. So these are kind of the features, and let me talk to you about the characteristics in kind of a framework way. Next slide. So let's look at it from a documentation, process, measurement, compliance, disclosures, and inclusion. And these kind of characteristics for the different types of level. From a documentation, there's none or very little. My guess is most employers, even if they capture themselves as a foundational level, they probably have some decent documentation. As I said, the three different levels kind of run in a spectrum, and they're not monolithic. It doesn't mean that you have all elements of one tier or another. You could have some or all of them, and just sort of basically loosely grouping you to those three categories. So that's documentation. Process, basically loose or non-existent job structures, and there's really no sort of documented, structured process in place to achieve pay equity. Measurement, there isn't any, or very little. Compliance, there's not this confident awareness of what the pay equity laws and regulations are, and you know, being current on it. From a reporting or disclosure requirements, they're not complying, and that's like a big red flag there. And there's no inclusion thought in terms of where employees are for involvement. So with that, those folks who are, you know, largely in the foundational level, maybe I should say. Let's start talking about how to ascend to the next tier. Next slide. Okay, so what you typically see in terms of what metrics a foundational element employer has are these kind of things. You see, there are substantial gender and race, ethnicity pay gaps and pay disparities, and I'll get into the difference in a moment. They have a low diversity score, not just in terms of who they're reaching out to, but who they're getting. So both a representation and utilization. They aren't taking into consideration employee sentiment. And as I said earlier, or alluded to earlier, there's a low compliance score with respect to regulations and likely pay discrimination laws. So, with regard to the compliance score, particular red flag, if you're in a jurisdiction such as California, Illinois, jurisdictions where there is a pay reporting requirement, and you're not actually getting the metrics to do so, that's going to be a risk. Now, California and Illinois, two states where it's going to be a big deal, is even if let's say you even do the pay data reporting, what you are typically doing is they're modeled typically after the EEO1 component 2 style reporting. And what that reports are just the raw pay gaps, by race, gender, ethnicity. And so you see from like different job classifications, how many of each category you have in the different job classifications and in the different job bands. The problem with that is it doesn't consider why Susie got paid less than John. And that's that could be a legitimate reason. Let's say that the job position is HR, but Susie is really more of an HR assistant who just started out, and John has more of a managerial role, but for whatever reason, they're kind of lumped into the same category. And so it looks like, John's getting paid way more than Susie, but he's been with the company for 9 years. Susie's just started. He's got certifications, whatever, things that legitimately would justify why John gets paid more than Susie. But when you're looking at these sort of pay data reports, all you see is that this woman got paid a lot less than this man in ostensibly the same job category. So that's why I'm saying raw pay gap versus the actual pay disparities, which are ultimately what an employer is going to get on the hook for in a pay discrimination lawsuit, not so much the raw pay gaps. But when you're submitting these reports, are you actually looking at what the disparity is and not, glossing over the raw pay gaps? The good news is typically these raw pay gaps get shrunk down to hopefully no, but little or smaller pay disparities when you consider these legitimate business factors. Okay, so I wanted to make mention of that. So with that, I also want to make a brief mention about employee inclusion sentiment. Now, we're focusing here on the pay equity portion, or the E part of DE&I, but pay equity doesn't, it doesn't stand alone. Pay equity is impacted by your diversity program, by your inclusion program. And by inclusion, I'm talking about, employee inclusion sentiments or how they feel. And you might say, well, gosh, that's just a perception. But you know what? Perception has real material impact, particularly winning the war on talent, attracting talent, and gosh, keeping talent. Okay, next slide. So what are the typical tools of a foundational employer? What you see here are these sort of, kind of basic reports, annual overall pay reports. This is something that might be provided by your payroll provider. You probably have an org chart or employee roster by, Joanna Kim Brunetti, my title, how much I get paid. You could put that together pretty easily with the given spreadsheets that you have, and most HR departments are going to already have this. And if you're over 100 or more in employee size, typically you will have had to submit what's an EEO1 component 1 report, which is basically the demographics of your employees, based on race and gender. So you have the raw data, if you will, in a fairly easily accessible form to, for one, identify the raw pay gaps. You don't have the details to do anything further than that if this is all you have. So, this also doesn't go into the other aspects of equity that can implicate pay equity, like hiring, promotions, retention. So you don't have an accurate picture of where you are. You just have sort of one little snapshot with regard to raw pay gaps. So you don't know exactly where you are. And so it's hard for you to identify what your goals are and the reasons why you are where you are and whether or not over time you've made any progress. Next slide. So if you want to advance to the next level and you are a foundational employer, these are the kind of conceptual things that you want to put in place. Put in the DEI measurement system. So, all the things that we talked about that need to be measured, not just pay, but at the other aspects of equity, as well as your diversity numbers and, doing an inclusion survey, which can be very simple. Putting a system in place so you have your baseline. And then you measure your baseline pay to figure out where you are. Then now that you know what your baseline is, and then you figure out what your pay equity goals are, and also communicate your commitment and eventual progress to the applicable people who care, including your talent, your existing talent and your hoped for talent. I put in there EDGE certification level equal assess is, for example, if you are a foundational employer, one thing you may consider is doing something like EDGE certification. EDGE certification, it's a reputable global organization that provides independent auditing and certification procedures for pay equity and to classify you in one of these. And if you are, for example, in the assess, you are basically saying you have a commitment to pay equity and you're getting started by doing this assessment and communicating that to your workforce or whoever else you want to communicate to. So let's go to the next slide. Okay. So the next slide, we're talking about level 2 now. And level 2, this is where probably most employers are. They have some pay equity planning, and they have some version or all of these kind of features. There's initiatives underway for achieving pay equity. DEI systems are in place and being used. There's actively meeting with employees, sort of transparency, leveraging their employee feedback. They are in fact compliant with pay equity laws and they're seeing improvement in diversity. So this is sort of level 2 programmatic, probably where most employers are. Okay, next slide. So from a framework, a pay equity model, maturity model framework, let's go through the categories. Documentation, they actually document their pay structure and their job philosophies for who gets more money, raises, etc. Processes, there are processes in place for each job that address each job. And through the onboarding, retention, promotions, etc. Each job is analyzed and evaluated and assessed. From a measurement, the pay gaps are assessed, the pay disparities. And remember, I made that distinction between a pay gap and pay disparity. Pay gap is just sort of superficially what you see. Pay disparity is sort of, what your actual differential is, the kind that you can't justify and that exposes you to pay discrimination lawsuit. You're looking at your diversity score and utilization, your representation across race, gender, age. You are measuring inclusion sentiment, equity metrics in terms of promotion, hiring, retention, basically the panoply of measurements you are undertaking. Compliance, you understand and you comply with existing law and you submit required filings. You are communicating your baseline statistics to employees and investors from a reporting and disclosure standpoint, and you are engaging in inclusivity with respect to your employees. Now, as I said earlier, these different categories, different tiers are not monolithic. So you're like, oh, shoot, we don't have one of these. We are therefore not programmatic. I don't mean it that way. Programmatic is, you're some level programmatic, but you can see what you may be missing, where there are deficiencies. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the metrics, and we, kind of alluded to what the metrics are. At the programmatic level, you have all the D, E, and I metrics. And focusing on pay equity metrics in particular, one of the really good things that come out of actually analyzing your pay equity analytic metrics is it helps identify root causes. So it gives you some insight into what procedures or policies you as an organization have that have caused you to have the pay disparity in the first place. So you might have what we call hotspots. So maybe you have a department that the pay is just like an outlier in terms of, let's say, I'm just going to give you this example as a makeup example. Let's say in your IT department, the men are getting paid way more than women, like, a tenfold difference. And in your HR department, you don't have that difference. So when you run through all the analytics and you see these outliers, it's like maybe there's a problem with that department. Maybe there are built-in biases from the managers. I'm not saying it's not to say necessarily that anyone is nefariously doing something. Sometimes things are being done without trying to do it. It's sort of de facto versus sort of intent versus just what actually happened without meaning to. So root causes of the pay disparities can be identified when you actually run the metrics. The DEI, you can also look at your DEI numbers and measure it against global standards. So if you are an organization that has US locations and outside locations, there are benchmarks for that are available, and you can compare that to where you are. And sort of internationally, there is an increasing trend towards kind of a standardized corporate governance reporting that includes diversity, for example, and pay. And also the metrics at the programmatic level, if you've done them, you can ensure your compliance with whatever applicable pay equity laws apply. Okay, next slide. And so, the tools that are used by organizations at the programmatic level, obviously there's just a ton of data. So you need to have it in, you can't do it on the back of an envelope. Typically it's done by software. And because pay equity involves fairly sophisticated statistical analysis, completely out of my pay grade, I could not do it myself. So even if you have the data, you need to run, a reliable and defensible statistical analysis. So you're going to need software to do that, and make sure you know what software you're actually using. And so the software actually measures the pay gaps and the baseline DEI metrics. It also manages your annual compensation cycle, because obviously there are changes every year and month to month. And what the software can be used is to also measure the pay disparities, monitor the remediation progress, and also potentially to do government filings for you, like if you are in, say, California or Illinois, for example. Okay, next slide. So, generally speaking, you should feel pretty good if you're mostly in the programmatic level. But this is about advancing to the next level and winning the war on talent. So is that enough? And the answer is no, particularly given the COVID zeitgeist right now. So utilizing and actively, routinely acting on the measurement system finding as a business practice. What it means is, like, programmatic is, you're doing, generally speaking, all the things you need to do, but you haven't necessarily achieved the results. So, the key is going to be monitoring also, because workforces are incredibly fluid. If you take a picture of your workforce today, will it look exactly the same 12 months from now? I highly doubt it. People get hired, people get fired, people get promoted, people get raises, and less frequently, people might get demoted or, switch job classifications or whatever. Workforces are just a moving target. So, it's not enough just to get a snapshot. You have to get a baseline and you got to measure it on an ongoing basis to see whether there's been progress or gosh, you're reversing course. Just monitoring that and understanding what your picture is so you actually know what you need to do to remediate. Now, I had mentioned EDGE certification before. EDGE certification is a third party, reputable certification process. And what they would identify this as a move. It means that you're showcasing progress. It doesn't mean you've achieved it, but you're certifying that you are making progress. And that's obviously very important. And especially because most employers are in this bucket. I'm not saying you should be satisfied and rest on your laurels that you're making progress, though you haven't achieved it. Most employers are probably in this category. And so obviously if you want to stand out for that just super awesome talent that you want to bring in, hitting the next level is going to be really valuable. Okay, next slide. Level 3. You might say, oh gosh, level 3, that's nirvana, I'm not going to reach it. No, level 3 is what's called the strategic level. It is certainly the gold standard, but as I said, that pesky workforce that keeps changing time over time, just because you've hit your goals doesn't mean you're going to maintain your goals. And so strategic level is really talking about basically maintaining that goal. So, from a feature standpoint, you've got DE&I, goals achieved, you're utilizing tools to ensure pay decisions are fair. You are communicating your progress to your stakeholders. There's ESG, CSR reporting in place. That's becoming increasingly important, particularly for publicly traded companies. You've achieved this sort of highest edge level, which is called lead, and you are doing that kind of accountability. Okay, next slide. So when we're looking at characteristics, and again, the same kind of framework, documentation, process, measurement, compliance, reporting and disclosures, inclusion. It's you really kind of check on all of that. That's what you're seeing. So the next point is, again, because workforces are fluid, the fact that you've achieved it, the question is, are you maintaining it? That's going to be the next question. So if you look at the next slide, the next slide talks about the metrics. And we talked about those root causes, those hotspots before. Strategic employers have actually eliminated those hotspots. They realize there's something funky with a particular department or maybe a particular manager, or there isn't a policy in place that could have, eliminated the pay disparity. You've taken care of those things. Your pay disparities are resolved. And your messaging is showing your equal pay commitment, and you've achieved those standards. And so you need to, maintain that. It also leaves room for new initiatives. When you've reached your goals, you can create new ones. I mean, winning the war on talent is increasingly more about innovation, what sets you apart from everybody else. And if you are at the strategic level, you have the luxury of looking at those things. Okay, next slide. And I talked about earlier about the software ensuring pay equity. The tools that you need that are used by strategic employers are the software that basically ensures pay equity from the point of our hire to the end. And they're monitoring it, and they are a leader according to EDGE, which is they've maintained the goals, they've achieved the goals, and they are maintaining it. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so let's launch the next poll question.
All right, it's rolling there now. It's rolling there now. So this one is, what stage of the pay equity maturity model are you in? And the foundational, the programmatic, strategic, or you don't know. We'll just let this roll for another 20 seconds or so, and then I'll close the results and share them with you, Joanna.
Terrific.
So far, excellent presentation. Thank you so much. All right, many have participated, so we will end the poll. And there you are.
Okay, so what we see is 45% of you are in the foundational, 15 are in the programmatic, 8% are in strategic. Congratulations to you guys. 32% are in the I don't know. So, what we see is kind of, they kind of run the gamut of the different categories. And for those folks in the foundational, you really, really want to start gathering the metrics. It's going to be super, super important. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so with all that we just talked about, pay equity wins the war on talent. And I want to talk about some of these stats that we found. Next slide. Here's just some statistics that we found. There's so many more, but just really to kind of illustrate that pay transparency is so important to winning the war on talent. And I say pay transparency with respect to pay equity. So providing transparency to attracting new people, maintaining new people in terms of what it is you're paying. But obviously, if your pay is horrible, transparency isn't going to help. So you want pay transparency that provides that kind of pay equity picture that is so important and increasingly important to particularly professional staff and younger workers. 80%, more than 80% say they are more productive and engaged when they're paid fairly, or their perception of fairness. And I talked about earlier about inclusion sentiment, about what employees feel. And I've certainly heard from enough folks where they're like, well, that's just what they think. It's not what the actual numbers are. That is true. However, the sentiment, the way they perceive things translates into how they accept pay raises, whether or not they feel like it was fair to them. So they don't think it's fair, they leave. How job applicants perceive you as a company. So that perception is extremely important. And 80% of work, or more than 8%, are more productive and engaged when they're paid fairly. Less job dissatisfaction, which of course, job dissatisfaction will lead to termination. 75% of job seekers believe a diverse workforce is an important factor when considering a job. 75% of employees are more likely to apply for a job for a company that promotes pay transparency. 70% of job seekers value compensation most when they're deciding jobs. So compensation, so that whole pay transparency, whatever it is, hopefully it's good, is so important. 32% of leading organizations say their ability to recruit top talent improves as a result of DEI efforts. While that stat alone, it's less than 50%, but there is a sizable minority of people that recognize that DEI is important. So, where you are, having pay transparency and underlying pay equity is important for you from a market standpoint to attract talent. Okay, next slide. So we did, I had talked about the survey, this Harvard Business Review analytics that had conducted a survey for us with SHRM. That survey came out with really kind of echoes what I'm saying here today, which is that leaders in pay equity prioritize pay equity as a strategic initiative. And in that survey, they found that 2/3 of all employers consider pay equity an important strategic initiative, but leaders, so that's the top third, so half of those that consider it as important strategic initiative. The leaders who are actually successful in achieving pay equity, they consistently engage in these kind of behaviors. And I want to make special mention in terms of work that these leaders work harder to measure pay equity progress across a wide range of metrics and are more likely to share their results with employees. So they do a lot more measurement and they engage in pay transparency. Another point I wanted to mention is accountability. Leaders recognize that accountability is extremely important. Okay, next slide. So with all that said, in terms of incorporating pay equity in your organization, here are some things, sort of conceptual things to think about. Define your company equity goals, gain commitment from your leaders, and management down to your workforce. Gain a commitment to achieve it, and solicit your workforce feedback in terms of how you're going to achieve it. Perform a pay equity audit. Figure out where you are in terms of your actual pay. Are there pay disparities? Identify those root causes that drive those pay inequalities. Develop remediation plans, and because workforces are fluid, measure that progress regularly and course correct, and communicate your progress internally and externally. I'm going to mention that transparency isn't monolithic. When I say you should engage in pay transparency, I'm not saying, oh, it's one formula you identify all the job classifications and all the salaries for each. It doesn't have to be that granular, but communicating sort of where you are. There's so many different ways to slice and dice the data, of course, accurately, to communicate your message of either you've achieved pay equity or you're working to achieve pay equity. That messaging and transparency is important, and how you do that, you can figure out how you want to do that. Next slide. So, a lot of what we talked about are the analytics, because you need the analytics to go from one level to the next level. So, what are the tools you need? And I didn't really get into this so far, but it is something that's really important to mention. It's the 900-pound gorilla, or the elephant in the room, however you want to look at it. It's the data. We're all assuming all the data is super accurate, but humans make mistakes. That's why we're human. And workforce data is just, has the sort of garbage in, garbage out problem. If you are analyzing the data, if the data is bad, your results are bad. So it's really, really important to clean, consolidate, and analyze the workforce data before it's being processed. The next consideration, and I did talk a little bit about it, is those little legitimate business factors. You're going to have to gather the data to figure out, like tenure, seniority, things like that justify the pay gap is really just a pay disparity. Those factors, you're going to have to gather the data for that, and then basically the treatment of that. If it doesn't matter, like let's say you have two janitors and one has a PhD, that's not a factor into why, probably not a factor into why the person with a PhD got more, because it's not tied to the job at all. The tools should also create logical employee groupings for comparing wages. You don't want to compare the janitor with the manager necessarily when you're looking at sort of similar groups and determining pay disparities. And the tool should pinpoint the pay gaps, the pay disparities, and the root causes, and it'll give you the tools to create remediation models based on budget. Let's say you have a gigantic pay disparity, which hopefully you don't, but if you do, there isn't a one solution. Doesn't mean that you need to immediately pay it immediately, the pay adjustment, if you will. There are models that you can do over time. There are other strategies you can use from a budgeting standpoint. It also, you want a tool that's going to provide equitable and competitive salary recommendations, considering the locale and benchmarks and things like that. A lot of technology here, but you can get that to do your pay equity plan. Next slide. I want, that really segues into our PayParity solution. It provides all those analytics and the tools for those analytics that I just mentioned. There's an always-on pay equity analytics that identifies the actual reasons they're driving workplace inequities. Ongoing DEI monitoring provides visibility into your workforce culture. We also have our equal pay estimator that actually gives you recommendations for salaries, for new hires. Strategic communications for sharing your progress, and thoughtful benchmarking. We also can provide a format where if there's an attorney-client privilege, we can maintain that. And we also allow for same-day setup and implementation, so you can get started right away. Next slide. We do have our PayParity solution does have multiple options, and you can do it sort of your do-it-yourself solution software, There's also one kind of the managed services where it's a do it for me solution. And we also have something kind of in between. Okay, next slide. Rhonda, if you could launch the next poll question.
Absolutely. Yeah, with all of this great information, if anyone would like to meet and discuss with Trusaic your 2022 pay equity initiatives, you can just choose the option yes, and we'll just let this roll here, Joanna, and you can continue on.
Okay, all right, so let's go to the Q&A portion. Okay, so we have one question. My company submitted paid data under the recent California regulatory requirement. Can I use that data for my pay equity metrics? Sure, you can. But the problem with that is it's that EEO1 type reporting, and it measures the pay gap. It doesn't measure the pay disparity. And so you can use that, but you're going to show a bigger problem probably than you have. You may not have any problem. You may actually have no pay disparities, which is the one that sort of triggers the pay discrimination risk. But you've got like these huge pay gaps. So, if not for anything other than to find some comfort level and understanding that it's really not as bad as it might appear. And gosh, if you're submitting the pay data report, do you really want to be submitting the report without really understanding what the underlying risk is? And so you can use that, but it is a bad substitute. It doesn't benefit you to use that. You want to actually drill down into the details, figure out what the pay disparities, because that's going to be ultimately what your risk is. And you'll also probably see that it's not as bad as it might look on the pay gap. That's why I said, gosh, do you want to submit the pay data report without doing the analysis? Because you're submitting it to the DFEH, and there's right now current legislation talking about disclosing that to the public. I don't know, if it's going to pass, but it's right now, in consideration. So you're submitting this data, and it's saying that for different job classifications, women are getting underpaid. And it may be that because there are good reasons why John got paid, more than Susie or whatever, like on an individual level. And if you consider that the pay gap is not nearly as bad as it might look. So that's why I was saying you probably want to do that analytics before you actually do the reporting, so you know. Okay. Next question. Our company just acquired another company, and the purchase company is more advanced from a pay equity maturity model. How do we reconcile our pay equity metrics? That is a great question. Well, first and foremost, you don't have to have a one plan, one size fits all for all employees. And that's also in particular because you might have different jurisdictions. They might be in different companies, and you don't want to look at it in a vacuum. You want to look at what your benchmarks are for the locale that you're in. And sort of post closing, if it's already closed, you've already got this company, assess where the two companies are, and figure out, it's actually a great time in this sort of recent, if you recently closed the deal, it's a great time to reassess your own PE plan and your bought pay equity plan. And it's sort of a time where people are kind of expecting some changes, and so people are kind of primed for that. So you can interview sort of key people in the new organization and sort of the relevant people in your current organization, and come up with a plan. And it doesn't have to be identical because it may not make sense. There is not a one size fits all. There are aspects of one that, one organization that lends itself easier and just makes more sense to do where it doesn't apply in the other. So those are the things that you do want to consider, but think about it from a practical standpoint. Okay. Okay, I have another question. It says, is the tool designed for global companies taking in mind employment laws and salary regulations, as well as immigration, refugee laws in other countries? Okay, that is a whole lot of questions. So let me sort of take parts of it. The PayParity tool is designed for global companies. It does take into consideration the jurisdictional differences of the different countries. It doesn't address immigration and refugee laws, but the tool is very much designed for global companies because it recognizes the differences in the different locales. The standard is not the same in each country, so you have to be mindful. Okay, I have another question. What is the best way to share that you do pay equity? Internal staff, no, but what about for attracting new clients? Okay, so, like sort of how do you communicate to new talent, to new candidates, what you do for pay equity? I mean, like I said, you don't have to, and you may not want to disclose the sort of, the nitty gritty of the dollars. You could, for example, share sort of overall percentages. Like that's a little bit more, that's a kind of the UK model for pay gap differences. You could do it that way. In terms of where you share it, you could post that on your website. You could post that as part of your job, your job posting. There's a number of ways you can do it. You may have your own reasons as to how much you want to disclose. But as I said, transparency doesn't mean the same thing in every instance. I think the key thing is that you want to communicate that you have a commitment to pay equity. And in terms of what you've achieved, how, that could be one of many different things. So long as it's consistent with the message of achieving pay equity. Okay, I think we probably have time for one more question. We did a pay equity audit last December. How often should we repeat it? Well, I think that's terrific. Well, one, you want to do a pay equity audit like the full-blown audit once a year. Because of the pesky workforce constantly changing, evolving, moving in and out, you want to have some kind of monitoring, like monthly monitoring would be a good way to do it, because there can be significant changes over the course of 1 year. And so you want to kind of look at your baseline, let's say it was in December 2021, and then for each month, sort of how it's changed from that. Each snapshot once a year, is going to be different. And so, you want to see how that's changed and help you see progress. We don't have time for any more questions, but to the extent there are any other questions, and I haven't been able to go through all the chat to figure that out. If there are other questions, we will make sure that they're provided to you in one form or fashion. So with just a little over a minute left, let me turn it back to Rhonda, and thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you so much, Joanna. That was just excellent. I can see by the comments everyone found such great value in it, so I thank you so very much. Everyone, this is being recorded, so the archive will be on hr.com shortly. Also, your HRCI credit will appear in your account within 2 business days. We'll send you an email with a link to the recording as well as your credit information, so stay tuned for that. Also in the chat, I put a link to an exit survey, and as usual, when I close out this session, it's going to pop open in a new browser. So just take a moment to fill out that survey quickly for us and for the folks at Trusaic. We really appreciate your feedback. All right. Thanks again, Joanna. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.